Serious question. Does Doctor Strange crack anybody's top 5 favorite Marvel characters, and would we even remember him if he hadn't been in Spider-Man? Good evening, and welcome to the latest installment of Storytime. Today in our ongoing MCU retrospectational, we're looking at Doctor Strange, everyone's favorite classic beloved character who would definitely be just as popular if you all hadn't gone extra hard on Sherlock for whatever reason you did that for. The film, graded on the adjusted MCU curve, is actually not too bad at first blush. That is, it often looks pretty cool and has some interesting magic stuff, which means there are actually things for your brain to think about while you're watching. However, graded on any other movie scale, Doctor Strange ranks it, like a C- at best, because none of its interesting elements actually have anything to do with the story, which is as lazy, meaningless, and casually problematic as everything else in MCU. Surprise! In this episode, we're going to talk about how Marvel really only tells one story over and over and over again, how by this point in the series we're basically stuck in Groundhog Day, how this movie has actually cool stuff in it, and how it serves as a secret vehicle for Disney's terrible worldview. And maybe other stuff as well. So buckle up and get ready for a wild, trippy ride full of spoilers and critical analysis. If that isn't your thing, of course.
Get out of my church! Ow! Oof! Ow! Oof! Ow! Ow!
Doctor Strange is a 2016 film directed by Scott Derrickson. Prior to Doctor Strange, Scott was primarily known as a horror director, where it seems like he enjoyed reasonable success. He also directed the remake of The Day the Earth Stood Still.
I didn't do it.
The film was written by Derrickson and these guys, one of whom worked with Scott on his earlier horror stuff, and one of whom wrote Prometheus.
Woozle wuzzle?
The movie centers on who else but Dr. Stephen Strange, a neurosurgeon on the cutting edge of medical science. After a car accident leaves him unable to really use his hands, he goes to extremes to find a cure, his whole self-image apparently being tied to his ability to physically operate on people. He eventually finds his way to an Avatar magic school where he learns to be a magic bender and gets caught up in a crazy man's attempt to end the world. As you do when you're at magic school.
You're a wizard, Harry.
Here are our main players. Stephen Strange. Stephen, like I said, is a neurosurgeon. He is evidently the best there is, remembering arcane medical conditions with the confidence to act mildly to moderately unethically to be a hero doctor. He is abrasive, cocky, and generally thinks poorly of others who are not as brilliant as he is. There's something really familiar about him, and I just can't place it. Christine is Stephen's one-time sort of lover who works in the ER in the same hospital. She puts up with his insufferableness for reasons, swears him off, gets roped in by the plot to save him from a magic stabby, and then gets forgotten about by both Stephen and the movie. Marvel loves women. The Ancient One runs the Avatar Magic School in Kathmandu and is of indeterminate age. She is very wise and kinda sassy and knows a lot of magic, some of which she uses in ethically dubious ways, apparently, which makes her kind of interesting. Then she's killed by the plot so Stephen can learn a simple lesson to become a hero. Marvel loves women! Guy. In order to fulfill MCU's black sidekick quota, Stephen gets a black sidekick who definitely has a name we all remember. He had a hard childhood or something and therefore is incapable of seeing nuance in the world. He distinguishes himself from our other black sidekicks by turning into a villain we all forget about, for reasons. Other Guy steals time magic to invite an interdimensional time monster to destroy the world, which he apparently believes will bring back his dead family for reasons. The time magic gives him the same kind of sloppy kiss makeup as the blue guy in Guardians of the Galaxy, which is dumb. Wong. Not to be outdone, this movie gives Stephen not one but two minority sidekicks who, even though they have studied magic for far longer, are somehow inferior wizards to Stephen. I guess because they obey rules and he is too smart for rules. Wong is equally rigid in his worldview as Guy, but doesn't turn into a villain. Like all origin stories in MCU, this movie has the advantage of being able to pretend it's about something. It has a central protagonist with a very clear problem he is trying to solve, which, in theory, should produce some sort of plot related thereto. It doesn't, and that is the film's first big issue. See, the movie clearly shows us that Steven is obsessed with repairing his hands so he can go back to being a neurosurgeon, which is great. We love to see a driven protagonist, even if he's a dick. This is his one consuming desire, which means the plot should center around solving that problem. And it does at first, motivating his journey to Kathmandu after Western medicine fails him. The problem is the moment he gets there, the movie has more interesting magic bending to talk about and so forgets about his hands immediately. Now, in stories, often a character's initial desire will change over the course of the plot as they develop and grow, which is fine. Sometimes a character's initial problem is more of an inciting incident, the cold open, if you will, which allows us to meet and sympathize with the character so we're ready to go on the real journey with them whenever that happens. That is not what happens here. Steven never stops caring about his hands. The problem is that the movie wants to be about other things, so it has to more or less ditch the hand plotline. Let me explain.
No, there is too much. Let me sum up.
Steven's motivation to learn magic is presumably to fix his hands. If this is the case, the plot should center around his various attempts to heal them until he is either successful or accepts his condition.
Monsieur! I can walk!
Or his accident really is just an inciting incident, the thing that gets him to the Avatar School so he can discover what he is really interested in. Like, his hands get immediately healed and he decides to become a wizard, getting involved in the story's true plot about the time stuff.
I'm a what?
The movie we have splits the difference to poor effect. Steven injures his hands, explores solutions in a montage, goes to Kathmandu, mostly forgets about his hands as he learns magic bending, during which he never attempts to heal them, then gets accidentally caught up in saving the world with time so we can have another Xfinity Stone. The movie's main thematic concerns, such as they are, have nothing really to do with Steven's hands and more with time, vaguely, which is an indication of an undercooked plot. The script never tries to bridge the resulting gap between Steven's desires and the theme of the story. Steven basically stumbles upon the time magic out of no more than idle curiosity, which means that the writers were too lazy to give him a real reason to care about it, which is of course a problem. The solution to this lazy, unforced error is really quite simple. Show Steven trying to use magic to repair his hands, but maybe it's too hard or actually not possible or something. We know he will keep seeking more extreme solutions, so when he learns about the time spell, he has thought to use it on his hands. Basically, wind back the clock before the accident or whatever, which of course is not permitted, blah blah blah, and the rest of the movie can happen. Then Steven can learn that wizards don't use magic for their own behalf, but like doctors use their skills for the benefit of others, strengthening the hastily tacked on theme the plot killed Tilda Swinton for. But yeah, a story where stuff just kind of happens to the protagonist and he learns by accident is fine too, I guess. The other big issue with the story is that it is the same story as basically every other MCU hero. That is, it is the unrigorous and largely unearned redemption of a dick. See if this rings any bells. Steven is a smarter-than-everyone science man prodigy with likely personality disorders who mistreats those around him, especially his intimate partners. He is terminally self-centered and vainglorious and dismissive of rules, boundaries, and guidance. Through a journey in which he gets to be a hero instead of the many other people who are either more skilled or more closely related to the actual conflict, he learns the value of not being so much of a dick. He even gets a black sidekick to order around. Someday. He also has a girlfriend, in this case former girlfriend, who works in his field but in a slightly less prestigious position, about whom we learn nothing and who the movie basically entirely forgets until she is needed by the plot to help him. Worse here than in other entries is that this movie doesn't even pretend to give her closure. She gets to save his life and then for all we know never see him again. Marvel loves women, all of which is to say, we've seen all this before. Like, a lot. Like, this formula is present, at least in part, for all of our MCU heroes to date.
I'm on to you!
You might have heard the theory that there are really only 7 stories in the world, and that every story we tell is just a reworking of one of those. I'm not sure how much stock I put in that. I mean, it feels reductive even for me. But I do know this, that to this point in MCU, and with only a handful of exceptions down the road, Marvel only tells one story, and that story is the inspiring tale of abnormally smart and or talented white guys who have done nothing to develop those skills or intelligence apart from being gifted them by the world, becoming heroes by learning to be marginally better human beings to the women and non-white people around them who support them. Really rousing, vital stuff. Someone give them the Nobel Prize already. Lazy writing and mild racism aside, Doctor Strange does have some visually inspiring elements, which is great, because some is a lot more than none, which is our typical amount. Remember that dynamic, visually interesting kick-punching fight at the empty gray airport? Steven's first mind trip when he's flying around the universe and seeing weird stuff is really cool. It does a great job of indicating the possibilities of this new magic stuff, and it makes you want to jump into the story and explore. Of course, it would play better if we had any indication that Steven was searching for new forms of knowledge or had felt some kind of intellectual or spiritual emptiness, but it's still a cool sequence. We got the fingers turning into hands. Also cool are the mirror dimension sequences with the kaleidoscoping buildings and what have you. Turns what would be just regular old kick punching into something exciting and uncertain. A welcome injection of strangeness, if you will, and utilizing your premise to turn old things new. Good job. Lastly, I think the score deserves attention. It's hardly surprising that composer Michael Giacchino would do good work, but this movie actually has a score you can hum, which isn't necessarily an indication of a good or bad score in itself, but the fact that it is memorable and fun and playful and musically interesting is vanishingly uncommon in the MCU. I love that it borrows from 60s psychedelia and doesn't often feel too superhero-y. So good work all around!
Except for...
On the other hand, all this is a really low bar to clear. A couple of engaging and unique VFX sequences and a creative sounding score in a $175 million blockbuster tentpole should hardly be notable. In fact, if that's all that money bought, we should be pretty disappointed, like with a $40 burger that's served raw. But when your franchise makes a point of pandering to the lowest possible comedy denominator and is intently focused on replicating a monolithic sameness in each of its entries, such things stick out. Like a porcupine in the world's boringest nudist colony.
There's gotta be a better way to say that.
At this point, we are more than a dozen movies into the series. We're at 14, which in terms of James Bond makes Doctor Strange the view to a kill of the MCU. But while it took Eon Productions over 20 years to get to that movie, Marvel made it to Doctor Strange in 8, which means that, since they are all the same story with the same characters and the same problems, we're in major Groundhog Day territory. Since everything is basically identical, we perceive anything different to be good. So, Tilda Swinton running around on a sideways building feels like a significant cinematic achievement, even though that same basic imagery appeared a handful of years prior in one of the biggest movies of the decade.
Anything different is good.
And Steven having a bad trip feels fresh and exciting, even though it's mostly riffing on any trip sequence since the invention of the trip sequence in 1968.
Anything different is good.
I'm not the first person to say that MCU has a consistency problem, in that it is mind-numbingly consistent in its uninspiring look and feel. A kind of bland grayness per the directive of the beige overlord. As the series has progressed, though, you get the impression there have been attempts to spice things up a little bit. Posters go from muted tones to Crayola boxes, and the spacescapes of Guardians of the Galaxy are fun and spacey. Which is fine, but I think saying that MCU all kind of looks the same is misdiagnosing the problem. By saying that, you're ascribing your boredom to the things you are seeing, rather than the dull story that is being told, which is, of course, the true culprit. You can only tell the same story with the same protagonist solving the same problem so many times before people start to check out. I mean, just ask James Bond. By the end of the 70s, they sent him to freaking space because nobody really cared anymore, the formula having gone very stale. There's a reason they stopped making those every year. Of course, the sad thing is that rather than try and tell different stories or make more interesting characters, MCU has decided to basically just make some graphic design adjustments to the color palette. A characteristically lazy bandage for a self-inflicted and totally avoidable critical wound. The last big thing I want to talk about has to do with everybody's favorite topic, the Disney Corporation's propagandizing of neocolonialist dogma through family entertainment. This is a subject we've covered elsewhere by examining such characters as Tony Stark, Roger America, and Thor. But it's been a minute since we've defined neocolonialism, so I thought we'd have a little primer. Regular colonialism, of course, is the practice of colonizing a territory or group of people, almost always against their will. To one extent or other, it's kind of always been a thing. At least, groups of people have always been invading and conquering others. But colonialism as we know it is largely an invention of the modern world. As land and resources in Europe became more scarce through the 16th and 17th centuries, European powers decided to expand their empires by colonizing overseas territories, subjecting whatever people were there, who they didn't kill or enslave, to their rule via some variety of colonial government. The colonizers got the benefits of having new things to sell, cheap labor to make those things, and a place to send their criminals. And the colonized people got the benefits of not having the right of self-governance and the obliteration of their cultures. Everybody wins.
We would snatch 200,000 acres of Indian territory, which we have deemed unsafe for their use at this time. They're such children.
200,000 acres. 200,000 acres. What'll it cost, man? What'll it cost?
A box of these.
The colonial era basically died out in the mid-20th century, when the imperial powers of the world restored the independence of their colonies, for the most part. But the impulse to control and exploit faraway populations remained, leading to what scholars now mostly refer to as neocolonialism, the colonization of people not by governments but by corporations and other private interests. This takes place in a couple of forms. One is multinational corporations exploiting the labor and permissive governments of developing nations for their own gain, like with oil and mining. The other is with ideas, promulgating ideals of Western economics and philosophy that benefit the elite so they can continue or one day start to do number one. In the past, we've talked about how some MCU characters, like Tony Stark, Captain America, and Thor, represent certain colonial or neo-colonial practices. Doctor Strange provides a craftier than normal example of Disney promoting its neo-colonial ideals to its audience of children and unthinking adults, which is why I want to bring it up. Part of this message involves the not unracist coding of the Avatar magic school. On the one hand, it seems like the movie tries to take steps to show us that it's a cosmopolitan place for people from all over the world focused on otherworldly problems, which is good? Like, it's not racist because they've transcended earthly problems or something. But on the other, it's an Avatar magic school in Nepal where everyone dresses like costume store Buddhist or Taoist monks while playing into reductive Western stereotypes of these kinds of monasteries. This vaguely oriental coding helps us read the place as exotic and therefore other, therefore dehumanizing it to a subtle but not insignificant extent. Stephen makes a series of xenophobic assumptions about the place, which he is of course wrong about, but then the movie spends the rest of its time showing us how he is secretly right about his brusque science-minded approach to magic. From what we see, he only spends a few months there, meaning he is naturally better than everyone else there for no reason other than what he brings to the table, an old trope which has its deep roots in the explicitly racist myth of the enlightened European learning from and superseding the noble savage, a myth perpetuated to justify genocide and enslavement by colonizers. The other part of the message is the movie's commodification of magic. Basically, it tells us that magic comes from channeling energy from other dimensions, allowing us to do extraordinary things in ours. So, interdimensional energy is a resource the wizards can access for their own purposes at no cost to them. This has uncomfy echoes with the way corporations today view resources in other nations. Basically that because they can extract or exploit them, they will, regardless of the impact on those places whose populations don't tend to get the benefit of those resources anyway. In the movie, we don't know if harnessing this interdimensional energy has any impact on other dimensions, and we don't care because it is our hero's prerogative to access it. But flip it around, if the wizards became aware of some entity from another dimension extracting energy from our own, they would probably not be happy. Oh wait, that's exactly the plot of this movie. Ganon, or whoever from the Dark Dimension, shows up to essentially colonize Earth by absorbing its energy. Basically what the wizards are doing, albeit on a much larger scale. But the scale of the resource theft isn't the issue. It's that the assumption that the wizards have the right to energy that is not theirs is totally baked into the premise, to the detriment of the story. By the end, we're meant to believe that Steven is acting selflessly, when really all he's done is appropriated power that wasn't his for his own purposes. The same thing other guy is doing, and yet he is punished, and Steven, the virtuous and wise American, is made a hero. All that had to happen to make this not gross was that the Earth Wizards just had to be part of some interdimensional magic network made of various other space wizards who share magic stuff in order to serve the greater good. In this setting, the bad guys would be the ones who want to use magic for themselves rather than the benefit of the multiverse, allowing Steven to make a choice about whether he uses magic to cure himself or to do the doctorly thing and help others. Instead, we get a movie that says appropriating resources you didn't pay for is heroic if you use them to stop apocalypses of your own making. Here are other stuff I observed about Doctor Strange that perhaps you will find interesting or dumb. 1. Guy says that they imbue objects with certain magic, and that the objects choose the human they want to hang out with or whatever, which, in my mind, implies a level of sentience, which means basically that the magical objects are doomed to a life of waiting around for their soulmate to show up so they can do their bidding, which feels weird. 2. Steven gets stabbed in, the heart or whatever and just walks it off. Like you do. 3. Once again, we have a movie that fails to adequately explain and define the powers of the heroes. We get a hasty explanation of where the magic comes from, enough to learn that Disney is low-key trying to justify corporate incursions in developing foreign areas, but beyond that we don't learn what one has to do to harness that magic. What is a typical student's magical progression? Do different people have different proclivities? What happens if you do spells wrong? Can you develop your own spells? We need to know this so that we know how worried we need to be for Steven when he gets into his magic fight, and also to know how far off the deep end other guy and his followers have gone. You know, stakes.
Steak?
Money's too tight for steak.
Steak?
Sure, steak.
4. This is the 4th movie in the series to end with destroying an apocalyptic space laser. It's a giant interdimensional alien head, but it's a space laser. 5. One of the things we're running into as the series progresses is what these new heroes were doing during the previous world-ending events. I guess the wizards didn't care when Loki opened up a space portal and a bunch of hostile space aliens invaded New York, down the street from one of their sanctums. Almost like none of this was really planned and they're just making it up as they go along. 6. We get a new Xfinity Stone! And unlike all the others so far, this one actually does things. We see that it can manipulate time, moving it backward and forward and even making loops. The way the loop works doesn't make any sense because time stuff never does, but we see that the stone can do it, which is nice since the red one, the blue one, the purple one, and the yellow one all basically just make lasers and blow stuff up. 7. Steven basically forces Christine to murder a man via electrocution by proxy because that's what heroes do. 8. I love how when Steven traps that girl in the desert, she acts like she's stuck there forever, and not that she can just immediately open a portal to wherever she wants to because she's magic. I guess that's it. At the end of the day, Doctor Strange probably does a better job than most of MCU in tricking you into thinking that you've just watched a real movie. There's enough that looks novel to kind of make you forget that you just watched another version of the same story they always tell. But don't be fooled, this movie is no different than any other entry in MCU so far. It's just another dicky white boy getting turned into a hero through no effort or merit of his own at the expense of the women and non-white people around him. Nothing strange here. Anyway, be sure and join me next time when we'll be returning to the world of Guardians of the Galaxy, my most favoritist of all Marvel titles. Good night.
Man, this is crazy. I hope I didn't brain my damage.